It is the year 1661, and the sun rises over the tropical coastline of Ilha Formosa. In this most far-flung outpost of the Dutch Empire lies the coastal Fort Zeelandia, where a watchman gazes sleepily through the morning fog. As the mists fade, he spots a massive approaching fleet of Chinese junks, all united under one man, the Pirate King of southern China. Welcome to our video on the House of Zheng, a dynasty of sea lords who fought European and Chinese empires alike to become the undisputed masters of the East Asian seas. At the turn of the 17th century, the Asian world was one defined by a contrast of cloistered empires and new intrepid adventurers. China, ruled by the Ming emperors, had been closed off to the world for nearly 200 years. Foreigners were rarely allowed in, and the Chinese officially weren't allowed out. To the east, equally isolationist Japan had recently been united under the Tokugawa shogunate. By the 1540s, explorers from Europe had arrived in Asia, seeking the wealth of the Orient. The Chinese and Japanese generally saw these strangers as uncouth barbarians, but due to their sailing prowess and firearms, the Christians soon asserted themselves as intermediaries in international trade. By 1580, the Spanish and Portuguese had established footholds in Manila, Macau and Hirado, port cities that grew into wealthy centers of commerce and attracted ambitious entrepreneurs from all over the world. Perhaps the most prominent of these entrepreneurs were the representatives of the Hoklo people. Sailing from the isolated southern province of Fujian, these skilled Chinese sailors regularly defied the isolationist policy of Beijing. Prominent communities of Hoklo traders lived in Chinatowns throughout Asia, while Chinese pirates plied the sea lanes from Malacca to Nagasaki, preying on unprotected merchant ships. Of all the corsairs on the South China Sea, the greatest was a man known as Zheng Jilong. Born in 1604 to a wealthy family in Fujian, he was exiled from his home for delinquency and travelled to Macau, China's seedy window into the outside world. There he was baptized by the Jesuits and learned much of European culture. Before long, the ambitious Hoklo found work aboard a trader. In Nagasaki, Jilong was adopted by a wealthy Chinese magnate and inherited his fleet of ships when the merchant died. Meanwhile, the Dutch, headed by their national mega-corporation, the East India Company, were ready to make their claim on the spices of the New World. Thanks to the efforts of a certain English samurai, William Adams, the Protestants had established a factory in Hirado in 1609, and now sought to get a foothold in China while ousting their Spanish and Portuguese rivals. Zheng Jilong, however, looked upon these foreigners and saw an opportunity. As both he and the Dutch spoke Portuguese, he worked his way into their trust as a translator and helped the East India Company create a base in Taiwan. The Dutch soon realized that this bold young Hoklo at the head of a vast fleet of ships could be a valuable asset to them. Jilong was quickly offered a position as a privateer of the Dutch East India Company. It was a simple arrangement. He would be provided with European muskets and cannons, and in return, he was to raid Chinese shores, thereby pressuring the Ming court to open trade with the Dutch. Never one for scruples, Jilong was quick to accept, and his fleet of lightly armed Chinese junks were quickly converted into high-powered warships. Jilong soon proved to be an incredibly capable admiral. Hoisting the Dutch flag, he and his ships ravaged the Chinese coastline with impunity. His renown quickly grew, and soon freebooters and fortune seekers from across Asia had joined his fleet. By 1627, the Hoklo Sea Lord commanded 400 junks, crewed by Fujianese pirates, Japanese samurai, European mercenaries, and even African musketeers, former Portuguese slaves that now served as freedmen alongside their Chinese commander. By 1628, Jilong had either eliminated all the other major Chinese pirate fleets or consolidated them into his own. Naturally, the Ming sent their own navy after the upstart corsair, but centuries of isolation had left their naval prowess lacking, and the Hoklo Sea Lord blew the ineffective imperial ships out of the water. Before long, Zheng Jilong was the undisputed greatest power in the South China Sea. It was quickly becoming evident to Jilong that he no longer needed the Dutch. After all, why work for some barbarians on the edge of the world when you can be legitimized by the Emperor of China himself? Switching allegiances, he surrendered to the Ming dynasty. It was an offer the beleaguered court in Beijing was unable to refuse. This upstart pirate had already effectively seized control of their entire southern coastline. Better he work for them, they thought, than for the Dutch. The Hoklo Sea Lord was appointed Admiral of the Coastal Seas by the Chongjian Emperor, rendering him no longer a criminal of China, but one of its most powerful lords. Of course, the Dutch were none too happy about their most valuable asset turning against them. Deeming that Jilong was a traitor, they deployed a fleet of warships to eliminate him. Under normal circumstances, Chinese junks were no match for a European warship, but Jilong was savvy to the ways of Western warfare. He soundly defeated the Dutch in 1633 at the Battle of Liaolou Bay. To the Chinese, this triumph was a miracle at sea, with one Ming bureaucrat grimly remarking, "Ever since the Red Barbarians arrived, this kind of victory has been extremely rare." Be that as it may, there was no mistaking it. An up-jumped Hoklo pirate was now the undisputed master of the East Asian seas. For a time, Jilong ruled a vast maritime empire alongside his kinsmen, dominating nearly all seabound trade from Manila to Nagasaki. But prosperity was not to last, and dark clouds loomed on the horizon for the House of Zheng. For decades, the Manchu people had been fighting a bloody war against the Ming in the far northeast of China. In 1644, they took advantage of a peasant revolt to storm out of their ancestral homeland and capture the imperial capital of Beijing. The peoples of southern China resented the idea of Manchu domination. To them, the northerners were crass barbarians, and under their rule, ethnic Chinese were forced to shave their heads into a Manchu queue, a humiliating act of submission that betrayed their deep Confucian values. For Zheng Jilong, the path was clear, and he declared his support for the Ming resistance. It was a dire situation. The Ming Emperor had committed suicide, while both the northern and southern capitals of Beijing and Nanjing were in the hands of the Manchu, whose Qing dynasty now controlled 2/3 of China. The south needed a new figurehead to rally around, so Jilong found an imperial prince hiding in Hangzhou and escorted him to Fujian. There he was coronated as Longwu, Emperor of the Southern Ming, a rump state with the city of Fuzhou as its capital. For a time, the Zheng clan was able to use the natural defensive choke points of their domain to protect their imperial ward, but before long, crippling food shortages and famine had laid the province low. Spread too thin to defend the hinterlands, Zheng Jilong withdrew his troops from the mountain passes and retreated to his coastal enclaves. As a result, the Manchus were able to march into Fujian and occupy Fuzhou. The Longwu pretender fled westwards, but was captured in the mountains and put to death. Recognizing where the wind was blowing, the Zheng Patriarch renounced his loyalty to the Ming and made overtures of diplomacy to the Qing. In 1646, he attended a banquet hosted by a Manchu commander, with only his special honor guard of African musketeers as protection. Originally willing to cut a deal with Jilong, the Manchus soon changed their mind and had the Sea Lord arrested. As the story goes, his African vanguard fought to protect the Patriarch's liberty, dying to the last man while trying in vain to prevent the seizure of their lord. With Jilong imprisoned, anyone could have been forgiven for assuming the Zheng clique would collapse like a deck of cards. But this was not to be, as one Zheng Sen rose from the shadows. Born in Hirado in 1624, the boy was the product of union between Zheng Jilong and a Japanese woman. He had moved to Fujian as a young child, and had been trained his whole life to one day rule the Zheng's maritime empire. To his people, he was known as Koxinga, Lord of the imperial surname. Unlike his father, he remained fiercely loyal to the Ming. Manchu forces had burnt down his family manor and captured his beloved mother, humiliating her until the proud Japanese woman was compelled to commit seppuku. Driven by his personal honor and desire for vengeance, Koxinga resolved to continue the fight against the Qing, whatever the cost. At only 22 years old, Koxinga had eliminated several scheming relatives and become the undisputed head of his clan. From his fortress at Ansai, he rapidly reconsolidated the Zheng fleet. By 1650, he had hundreds of war junks at his disposal, along with 40,000 soldiers, comprised of Ming loyalists, Japanese samurai, and African gunners inherited from his father. For the next 10 years, Koxinga led his forces in a dogged struggle against the Qing, at times managing to seize land, and at times being pushed back to the sea. In Guangzhou, a new prince had been crowned as the sovereign of the Ming. While Koxinga pledged his loyalty to this new Yongli emperor, the young Sea Lord's struggle against the Manchus was really its own isolated theatre of war. The campaign began strongly. In 1651, Zheng troops struck like lightning, expelling the Qing out of Zhengzhou and Quanzhou. Koxinga himself led the charge inland, with stories claiming that due to his Japanese heritage, he fought with the ferocity and martial discipline of a samurai lord. By 1652, his vast navy had fanned out and established control over a 1,300-kilometer strip of coastline, stretching from Zhejiang to Guangdong, while his control of rich sea lanes from Japan to Vietnam kept his soldiers paid and fed. Taken aback by this stunning string of defeats, the Qing were forced to bring Koxinga to the bargaining table. In 1653, they wheeled out their prized hostage, Zheng Jilong. The old patriarch implored his son to capitulate just like he did, but Koxinga was undeterred. He spurned his father's pleas and left him to his fate. Thus, in 1654, war resumed. In 1656, the Manchu Prince Jidu sailed down the south coast at the head of a massive fleet to confront Koxinga in open battle. The wily Sea Lord proved a tough opponent on his home turf, burning down the capital cities of Zhengzhou and Guangzhou and scorching the countryside to starve his enemy, before utterly destroying the beleaguered Qing fleet off the Kinmen Islands. With the Manchus now direly short on ships, Koxinga crossed his own personal Rubicon and in 1659 launched a full-scale campaign to retake the imperial southern capital. The offensive started out strong, with Zheng forces sailing down the Yangtze River and seizing the fortified towns of Guizhou and Zhengjiang. By August, their army of 85,000 was at the gates of Nanjing itself. Much of Manchu-occupied China watched with bated breath, ready to rise up should Koxinga reign victorious. And yet, it was not to be. Although he had Nanjing on the ropes, the Sea Lord did not attack immediately, instead giving the Qing garrison a 2-week grace period to surrender themselves, during which time he entertained his troops with glamorous festivities. This gave the Qing time to call for reinforcements, launch a fierce counterstrike into Koxinga's army, and force him to retreat. The failed siege of Nanjing was a turning point for Koxinga's fortunes on the mainland. He'd lost his momentum, while in the east, the other pocket of Ming resistance was smashed when the Yongli pretender suffered a crushing defeat and was forced to flee to Myanmar. This meant that the Zheng clan stood completely alone against the full, undiverted might of the Qing army. Koxinga knew that holding the mainland was now becoming more and more unlikely, and that in order for his maritime dynasty to survive, he would need to relocate to a more secure base. For that, he looked eastward to Taiwan. In the eyes of the Chinese emperors, Taiwan had long been an island that existed beyond the boundaries of civilization. The principal inhabitants of the land were the native Aborigines, the ancestral cousins of the Malay and Filipino people. They had inhabited Taiwan for thousands of years. Living along the coastline was a small community of Chinese Hoklos. Numbering about 50,000, many of them had migrated to the island to avoid the ongoing war in China. It was the Dutch East India Company, however, who were the masters of the island, ruling from their power bases of Fort Provincia and Fort Zeelandia. Capitalists before all, Taiwan generated the company a tidy profit, and they were unlikely to give the island up without a fight. Nevertheless, the Hollanders proved to be despotic rulers, for the Chinese were taxed heavily, while the Aborigines were subject to exploitation and Christian assimilation. The arrival of the Great Fleet of Zheng would be a spark upon an island ready to erupt into chaos. On April 30th, 1661, Koxinga came upon the west coast of Taiwan at the head of 400 junks with 25,000 men. They docked in the Leman Peninsula, where the local Chinese settlers greeted Koxinga with delirious joy, rushing to help the army make landfall. The Dutch garrison numbered only 1,140 soldiers and 8 warships, led by Governor Frederick Coyet. Being so direly outnumbered did not render their situation hopeless. European weapons were still far superior to Chinese ones, and in their eyes, one Dutchman with a musket was worth 100 Chinese armed with spears. Indeed, Koxinga's forces lacked modern firepower, with only his Africans having access to European rifles. In order to prevent the rest of his army from landing, Governor Coyet deployed 4 of his 8 warships, led by the flagship Hector. In response, Koxinga dispatched 60 junks to engage. For a while, European firepower reigned supreme, with Hector alone blowing 8 junks to smithereens and forcing the rest to scatter. But in an unfortunate twist, a lit fuse hit the ship's gunpowder magazine, causing it to explode and the other ships to flee. Koxinga landed the rest of his troops unopposed. At the head of a 4,000-man vanguard, the admiral advanced upon Fort Zeelandia, where he was accosted en route by a contingent of 240 Dutch gunmen. The Chinese were able to negate their enemy's firepower by outflanking the musketeers, killing half of them. The island natives, meanwhile, defected en masse to Koxinga. They burned their Christian schoolbooks and struck out in their tribal war parties, hunting and beheading any of their former colonial masters they could find outside their fortress walls. Following these setbacks, the Dutch attempted to reason with their foe. They and Koxinga had been functioning business partners prior to this, and it had been the Chinese admiral's father who helped them settle on Taiwan in the first place, so why attack now? The Sea Lord replied, "Hitherto this island had always belonged to China, and the Dutch had doubtless been permitted to live there, seeing that the Chinese did not require it for themselves. But requiring it now, it was only fair that Dutch strangers who came from far regions should give way to the masters of the island." Koxinga gave the garrison at Zeelandia a choice. If they flew his flag over the fort, he would accept their surrender and allow them to sail to Batavia unharmed. If they wished for war, then they were to fly a red flag. Meanwhile, the Chinese had encircled Fort Provincia. Lacking in fresh water, the Dutch commander there surrendered. Koxinga ruthlessly ordered the men in the fort executed and the women taken to become concubines for his officers. He hoped this would terrify the garrison in Zeelandia into quickly giving up. Inversely, this did little but steel Dutch resolve. On the morning of May the 4th, a red flag flew over Zeelandia. The Hollanders were ready to make their last stand. On May 25th, an overconfident Koxinga launched a full-scale assault on Fort Zeelandia. This was a mistake. Well entrenched in their walls, the Dutch decimated the exposed Chinese with their muskets and artillery, killing over 1,000 while losing only 3 men in the defense. Realizing his only real option was to wait them out, Koxinga used his navy to cut off Zeelandia's access to the sea, then settled in for a long siege. The fort would hold out for 10 months, during which time the Chinese army chafed. Running low on supplies, they resorted to plundering Aborigine lands for food, resulting in the tribes around Fort Provincia rising up against them, killing over 2,000 of Koxinga's soldiers. Meanwhile, a fleet of 11 Dutch warships arrived from Batavia in August to reinforce their company comrades. Seeing no value in Taiwan and longing for home, many of Koxinga's men secretly abandoned the siege and sailed back across the strait, forcing the Sea Lord to use violent discipline to keep his army in line. Slowly but surely, the tides began to turn once more. By autumn, Koxinga had put down the Aborigine rebellions and re-secured their allegiance, while in September, he fended off a two-pronged assault from the fortress garrison and their naval reinforcements. His junks performed a false retreat maneuver to lure the Dutch ships into narrow waters, where they were sunk, captured, or forced to flee. On the landward side, skilled Chinese archers and deadly African gunners kept their foe pinned against the fortress walls. The coup de grace came in January of 1662, when a German defector entered the Chinese camp and made Koxinga aware of a strategic redoubt that overlooked Zeelandia from atop a hill. Acting quickly, the Sea Lord ordered his men to storm the redoubt, which they did in due order. With the Dutch now completely exposed to Koxinga's firepower from above, the fight was over. Governor Coyet offered his surrender on the 1st of February. He and his men were allowed to take their personal belongings and leave the island in safety. On the 17th of February, the Dutchmen marched out of their fort in full regalia, boarding their ships and sailing to Batavia. European colonialism in Taiwan had officially ended. For Koxinga, Taiwan was always meant to be a temporary base from where he could strike back to retake the mainland. However, he was shrewd enough to realize that in the short term, this was impossible. So, instead of reigniting war with the Qing, he set to building a new society on his island. He established a system of government that modeled the imperial Ming court, while migrants from the mainland flooded onto the island, fleeing Qing persecution. Taiwan, a region long considered a barbarian backwater to the ethnic Han, quickly developed into the most prominent haven of Chinese culture untouched by Manchu rule. Koxinga's crowning achievement would also be his last. 3 months after expelling the Dutch, he became infected with malaria. Unable to cope with the disease in Taiwan's tropical climate, he died on the 23rd of June 1662 at 37 years old. His son, Zheng Jing, succeeded the legendary Sea Lord. He reconstituted his Taiwanese domain as the independent kingdom of Tengning, and for 20 years maintained its liberty against both Dutch and Manchu invasions. It would be under his weaker, illegitimate child, Zheng Keshuang, that Taiwan finally fell to the Qing in 1683, ending nearly a century of the House of Zheng's domination over the South China Sea. People across the Chinese-speaking world honor the memory of the House of Zheng and their greatest patriarch for their own differing reasons. The Taiwanese people look upon Koxinga as their cultural forefather, with a reverence bordering on godhood. His resistance against the mainland is often compared with their own separate identity from the modern People's Republic of China. In China itself, the Zhengs are hailed as true patriots, whose noble resistance against the Manchu and European foreigners alike rendered them heroes to their people, while their ultimately failed desire to reconquer the mainland from their island base serves as an echo to the contemporary goal of political unity between the two nations on either side of the Taiwan Strait. Indeed, while the reign of these ambitious sea lords was relatively short in the grand scheme of Chinese history, they will live on in the social memory of millions of people for many years to come. We have more videos on Chinese history on the way, so make sure you are subscribed to our channel and have pressed the bell button. We would like to express our gratitude to our Patreon supporters and channel members who make the creation of our videos possible. Now you can also support us by buying our merchandise via the link in the description. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.